Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And this is the Keewatin, sometimes called the Keewatin, as she would have appeared 119 years ago, on the 1st of April. She came out, she was built in Scotland at Fairfield. But there was a little bit of a hitch from getting her to where she was going to serve, insofar as she was too long to fit through the Welland Canal locks of the day and probably also the Lachine River locks in the St. Lawrence. So this is the first half of her coming through. She had to be cut in half. Well, not actually, they cut the first third off the front of the ship, and they had to tow the two halves of the ship independently all the way up to Buffalo through the St. Lawrence locks and up through the Welland Canal, the old Welland Canal, and then the two halves were rejoined together in Buffalo, and the ship proceeded on to her new home port of Owen Sound under her own steam. And she was then final patch up was done. These cabins where she was cut, the decorating of the spaces inside was finished, and she joined three older ships that had been built for the Upper Great Lakes Service, Canadian Pacific Company. And these are the Athabasca, I think they're in that order, the Athabasca, the Alberta, and the Manitoba. Now, they were smaller ships, but the Athabasca and the Alberta were also built at Gauvin, and they too had to be brought up in halves. The Manitoba was actually built in Canada. It was built in Owen Sound. It was the only ship that was built here. British and Scottish shipyards, they had a particularly good reputation for building very fine ships. This is the Athabasca, a little bit later in her career. As I say, these ships have been in service since the 1880s and the 1890s. She's had her forward superstructure built up a little bit to give it more of the appearance of the new ships. There were two ships. There was the Keewatin, and the Assiniboia, which was a near identical sister ship. This is the Canadian-built ship, the Manitoba, seen a little bit later in her career when the ships were painted white and they were used. It was more emphasis towards pleasure travel during the summertime. Here we see the Keewatin at her home pier. The home port was moved to Port McNicoll in the first couple of years the ships were in service, because Port McNicoll provided a better rail link with Toronto and also a direct rail link with Montreal. Now, these ships were actually part of a much bigger picture insofar as they were part of Canadian Pacific, which was truly an intermodal transportation company. They were also operating liner services across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. And they also were the builders and the operators of the Canadian National Railway. So they wanted to have on their trains, in their hotels, and on board their ships the same level of luxury and service. The only difference being, if you were on a ship, you'd be looking at the world through a porthole. We're in a hotel, it would be a vertical window, and if you're on the train, it would be a horizontal window. But the service, the food, and everything was of the same very, very high standard across their whole sphere of operation. And they were truly intermodal because they operated transatlantic liner services to Quebec City and also Pacific services from Vancouver to the Far East, to Hong Kong and to Shanghai. So the Canadian Pacific Company foresaw Canada as being almost a direct line, an alternative Silk Road to China. It's kind of amazing to think of cities like Winnipeg and Calgary being on the Silk Road. But By the time they got the necessary supporting infrastructure into place, hotels and stations and what have you, unfortunately, the Panama Canal had already opened. So you could sail directly without having to leave your ship at all via the Panama Canal, or alternatively via P&O eastwards about. In those days, you could actually go around the world entirely using ships and using ports of the British Empire as it was then the British Commonwealth. It spanned the whole world. So these ships were built to a much higher standard than they might have otherwise had to conform to. We see also here, again, a slightly later view of Keewatin at her home port, Port McNicoll. She was much bigger than the earlier three ships insofar as there was an additional deck between the cargo deck and the superstructure deck up above. It was an additional deck for accommodation. She could carry 288 first-class passengers. The main deck, which was at the bulkhead deck level, this is at this level here, was a cargo deck. And that was a feature of most Muskoka and Canadian ships, is you had this cargo deck, because as well as carrying passengers, that was the principal way of moving cargo from place to place within the country. In those days, there were two ways of getting about, either by sea or by rail. Road travel was very much still in its infancy. And the idea of having a full-length freight deck was good because the hatches, the shell doors in the side of the ship, those could be worked from pier height. You didn't have to have, the ship didn't have to carry cranes and davits. The ports didn't have to provide craneage. You could lift cargoes, you could process cargoes in and out of the ship through the side hatches just with a short ramp. Or if you had palletized cargoes, you were putting them on board and removing them with forklift trucks. The plan of the ship, this is the Keewatin, is interesting because below the cargo deck, below in the subdivided in the watertight compartments below, you had open spaces that could be used for carrying bulk cargoes such as grain and pelletized iron. She did carry these cargoes early in her career. She did actually carry grain, but later on it was more just ordinary cargoes. I mean, if you bought an automobile and you were in Toronto and you wanted to take it to your home in Sault Ste. Marie or in the Lakehead, you put it on the ship, and they could actually drive cars on and off the ship using side ramps. So, although strictly speaking, she was not a roll-on, roll-off cargo vessel, she did have the capacity to carry cars and carried all manner of other things, even including horses. So these ships were very, very versatile. During the colder winter months, the passenger accommodation would be closed off. People didn't want to travel by sea, they would prefer to take the train, and the ships were still capable of making profitable voyages carrying cargo only. Here we get a look inside the ship, as these are from publicity photographs from Canadian Pacific. This is the lounge as the ship was built. So it was very much of the same sort of standard of quality and of comfort that you would expect on the Atlantic, on the Pacific liners. The dining room, very, very good service. The same sort of meals, the same sort of menus that you had, not only on the ships, but also on Canadian Pacific's transcontinental trains and in their hotels. The Chateau Frontenac, the Hotel Vancouver, our own Royal York Hotel, they were all part of the CPR total intermodal transportation package. So interesting too, because the whole machinery aggregate of the ship had to be aft of where they cut the ship apart to take it up through the seaway. You had all this open space at the center in the forward part of the ship. So you had this is on the cabin deck, the extra deck that was added. So you had this nice lounge area, a little bit like the type of thing you had on board American riverboats, where the stern wheel of riverboats, but because the paddle wheel was at the back, so was the machinery. So you had this open space in the center of the ship where the accommodation was. Otherwise, you would have hatch combing, hatch trunkings and funnel uptakes going up through the center of the ship. A typical first class, two-berth cabin, bunks, porthole. Not luxury, perhaps by today's standards, but very similar to the type of accommodation that you would find in first class on a transatlantic or trans-Pacific liner. Very much the same level of comfort. There were very few cabins in those days that had ensuite toilets. Accommodation was really quite Spartan compared with what you see in later tonnage. Here we move ahead to the 1930s, and the ship is at her home pier in Port McNicoll, and the train has brought passengers up from Toronto, 6 or 7 cars there. And it was a 2-night trip. The ship sailed at about 2:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesdays. You had a port call in Sault Ste. Marie on Thursday, and then you arrived at the Lakehead Friday morning. The 1930s was a very, very opulent time for Great Lakes ship travel. Canadian Pacific had these 5 ships still in service. Canadian National, they also had a 5-ship service, which was operated by Canada Steamship Lines. There were numerous other overnight services. There was a service from Milwaukee to Bar Harbor overnight on Lake Michigan. There was a huge, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, side wheel paddle steamer that carried 2,000 passengers called the C&B, which was operated by the on Lake Erie between Cleveland and Buffalo, and that thing carried 2,000 passengers. Company went bankrupt in the late 30s, and the ship ended up being rebuilt as an aircraft carrier. The side wheels, the side paddles were replaced with propellers. It was thought of a paddle wheel aircraft carrier was sort of ludicrous. Again, during the 1930s, you see the 2 ships, the Assiniboia and the Keewatin at Sault Ste. Marie. Very often the ships would be going in opposite directions, and they would need that sort of time. An interesting statistic, I don't know whether to believe it or not, it is said that during the summer months, you would have as many people asleep in berths on ships sailing the Great Lakes as you would on the North Atlantic. Now, that must have been before the Queen Mary and Normandy, but it's kind of an interesting thought. The Great Lakes were very, very busy. And I mean, even smaller ships like our dearly beloved Seguin, at one time, they had sleeping accommodation for 10 or 12 passengers just for the service on the Muskoka Lakes itself. So these were very, very busy waterways. And passenger ships in those days, to all intents and purposes, were ferries. You could go to the pier in New York or Liverpool or Le Havre or wherever with cash in your hand and say, I need to sail. I need to cross the Atlantic, and they'll just put you on whatever ship happened to be sailing out there and just walk on. That's the competition. This is one of the ships operated in collaboration with the Canadian National Railway. There were 5 of these vessels. They were bigger than the Canadian Pacific ships. There was one of those ships. These were operated by Canada Steamship Lines, and of course, there was a tragic fire at the on board the Moronic here in Toronto in 1949. So it was a pretty lucrative and a very, very, very prosperous shipping service all over the Great Lakes. But still, that was sea and rail were the 2 ways to move. After the war, things changed. And we were lucky because these ships normally would have been called up for wartime service, but nobody wanted to cut them in half again to take them down out through the seaway. So they stayed in situ, and we're lucky that Now, by this time, this is the 1950s, and we have the Assiniboia here at Port McNicoll. By this time, the smaller ships, the smaller three ships, the Athabasca, the Alberta, and the Manitoba, they had been retired. A lot of the smaller ships, because what was happening at this stage is the transport was changing. The 4-lane, the 400 series highways were beginning to be built. There were better roads, there were more roads. Work had started on the Trans-Canada Highway. Also, air travel was becoming a viable alternative for domestic, well, both domestic and international travel. So you had the alternative of going by air. More and more people took to the roads. More and more families had automobiles, and they simply got into the car and drove to where they wanted or needed to go. So only the two ships, the Keewatin and the Assiniboia, only they remained. And they remained in service until 1965. Canada Steamship Lines, they maintained a couple of their ships up until the mid-60s. Well, 1965, these ships were finally withdrawn from service. I think they were to have carried on in a cargo service, but they ended up being sold for scrap. Except there was the Keewatin was purchased by an American to be taken to Douglas, Michigan, where he had a marina, and to be operated and to be retained there as a museum ship. He paid the princely sum of $37,500 for the ship. You can't even buy a condo for that in any city I know of in Canada now.
But what would that be in today's dollars?
Yes, I mean, at that time, I know when we first, well, at that time, I think my father was earning about $5,000 a year. So,
1970, 1964, I was earning $3,600 a year
you were well paid.
as a teacher.
That was good money.
Well, they actually doubled the salary next year because it was considered to be so low
Oh,
for
really?
teachers.
Well, there you go. So here we see the ship in her new home in Michigan as a museum ship. And interestingly, when the ship was sold, she was still fully stored. They got not only the ship, but they got all of the china and there was the table linens, the bed linens, even the chamber pots were still on board. And so probably whatever meat was left in the refrigerators as well, who knows? But all of the fittings, all of the equipment came with the ships. She remained in Michigan as a museum ship until 2012. And at that time, the younger generation of the Peterson family, they did not want to be in the museum business. They wanted to concentrate on operating their marina. There was also interest in repatriating the ship to Canada because there was a rather ambitious project afoot to build a large complex of resort hotels, condominiums, and what have you in the center of Port McNicoll. And she would have become, what they wanted was to bring the ship back as a centerpiece to that. I think the plan was that they would operate the ship's restaurant in somewhat the manner of Captain John's Harbor Boat, for those of you who remember. Anyway, excuse me, the condo project failed. Here's Keewatin making ready to come back to Canada. So she ended up back at her old pier. Railway tracks are gone, the terminal building was gone, but she ended up back in home waters as a museum ship. I had the pleasure of visiting her during the, I think it was 2017. It was on a Mary Morton coach tour. And interestingly, we got to see the ship early in the afternoon. It was kind of fascinating because we boarded the ship at about the time you would have boarded for a sailing. I really have a feeling that I wish I could have, that we were actually going to sail because the accommodation had changed very, very little since the ship was built. They probably upgraded some of the electronics, the navigational electronics and that sort of thing. But basically, she was still the same ship that had been built in 1907. That's the lounge, the dining room, tables already set for lunch. It really felt as if we were going to sail. As you can see, all of the galley equipment was all there, the plates, everything, the cutlery, everything there. Sun was shining. It was just like I expected the ship to sail at 3 o'clock, and unfortunately, we had to get off and go back onto the tour bus. Nonetheless, that's just you get the feel of the Upper Great Lakes and just the feeling of doing a summer house and lunch. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm getting off topic. Sorry. Oh, yes, I wanted to. If you wanted to bring your tunes with you in the 1960s, you carried a phonograph and a heavy box of 12-inch vinyl long tape records. Again, as you can see, the cabin accommodation, the changed very little. I don't think the ship ever had an architectural or an accommodation room. You still only 6 of the passenger cabins on Keewatin and Assiniboia had ensuite toilets. The rest of us, we used communal. There were wash basins in the cabins, but there were communal bathrooms, communal sinks for shaving. That was preferential to shaving over the tiny little wash basin in the cabin. I remember being on a North Sea ferry once in the 1970s, standing around one of those sinks with 2 German passengers, and we were all using the same sink to shave. So there you go. But again, it was the very high standard of accommodation. Those rooms were kept spotlessly clean, and there were bath cubicles there as well, and toilets and all that. Anyway, a lot happened at the. There was talk in around about the time of pandemic of the ship being moved to Midland. It wasn't. Then come the pandemic, people couldn't get on board the ship to maintain the exhibits and that sort of thing. Everything was pretty run down, and the ship was becoming too much of a burden. Now, what had happened in the meantime? There was a similar condominium project failure in Kingston. The Great Lakes Museum in Kingston was going to be rousted from its home by the river. The former ship, can't think of the name of it now, the Alexander Henry, which was their museum ship, was taken up from the bay. So Kingston ended up taking the Keewatin. By this time, the condominium project had been changed, failed, whatever, and they wanted a nice ship they could show us the feature of their museum. So, for the first time in her life, from coming up to the Upper Great Lakes, Keewatin made her way back down through the St. Lawrence Seaway, which had opened in 1959. Here she's passing under the Blue Water Bridge near Sarnia. This took place over the summer of 2023. She was moved in 2 stages, 3 actually, because she came down to Hamilton for dry docking. We see her here passing the skyline of Detroit. That certainly wasn't there when the 2 halves first came up in 1907. The Welland Canal, and everywhere people turned out to see her. It was quite something that this venerable ship's coming home. Notice as well that she's the trim of the ship, she's down lower, she's down a bit by the stern, and that is because the machinery was concentrated in the aft part of the hull, and normally you would have ballast in the forward compartment to keep the ship on an even trim. But anyway, here she is with a rather nice shot of her actually after she was dry docked in Hamilton, the hull was serviced, and here she is leaving Hamilton. I think that was in August of 2023. So she was leaving Hamilton on her way down to Kingston. Very kindly paid Toronto a visit, mistakenly against the issue. So she made the final stage of that trip in September 2023, under tow, of course. Machinery is still on board the ship, but it's not operational. Ending up in September here at her new home in Kingston. And here she is alongside the Great Lakes. I don't know whether it's called Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes, so I think I prefer to just call it the Great Lakes Maritime Museum. So here she is. She has just arrived. Her wheelhouse is intact, but the railing is missing. There are no boats in the lifeboat davits. They are actually on the cargo deck inside the ship. So she's just arrived. Here we see a quarter view stone, this lovely spoon stone that she had. Very, very beautiful lines, very traditional ship. Come the May long weekend 2024, welcome aboard, and welcome aboard to take a trip back in history, to go back in a time warp, to go back 117, 118 years as it was then. Here we see the ship as she is now. We're looking here at the forward lounge, the main lounge, the observation lounge. Very, very much as built. The lighting, everything else. With artifacts, costumes and things like that. I think there's a gramophone or something in that corner with the lid up and that sort of thing. So you really do get the feeling of going back, just for the hour or so that you're on board, of going back in time to the era of these ships. This is the same room looking aft toward the main passageway and the main part of the ship. Lots of space. There was only 288 passengers on board. This is a very interesting space, and it's above the central lounge that I showed you earlier. And this is called the flower well. And ever since the ship was in service, I think sometime in the 1930s, these flower pots were fixed there, and they've been there ever since. Apparently, when the ship was in service, you had to be careful wandering around on the deck below while they were watering plants. They used watering cans with very long spouts. So I think most of that probably would have been done during the turnaround. But again, I find it interesting that at the time they started building these very, very large Royal Caribbean cruise ships with the linear apron, these long aprons that went, the ones that look like the Eaton Center. And I remember in a shipyard meeting saying, well, we've seen this before, because the American river boats, and of course our own Keewatin and Assiniboia. A thing I meant and neglected to mention, I meant to mention earlier, is that in the 1950s, these ships became of interest in naval architecture and design circles because a number of significant new passenger ships, primarily the Shaw Saville liner Southern Cross and the P&O liner Canberra, which we talked about with Laurie a couple of years ago. The idea was to move the follow-up takes that would move the machinery this far out so that the thing would be like a super tanker and you'd have all the space in the middle to be exclusively used for passengers. And these two Canadian Pacific ships were mentioned as reference ships in the design of those new ships that came into being during the 1960s. And whilst we can still enjoy Keewatin, Canberra, and Southern Cross, there was another ship as well, not Northern Star. They're long gone. They're long gone. So again, the dining room. Now the architectural style of the interiors. A lot of publicity material says you're going back to the Edwardian era, you're going back to the age of the Titanic, which is perfectly true. But the architectural style that was used, it was sort of a hotelier style. It was developed in the late 1880s and it was first introduced on the Cunard ships in the 1880s to give passengers a feeling of comfort being on board ship. It was a sort of a generic classic style with elements of Louis cars and Adams and that sort of thing, but it was a luxury classic style design. And this style of design continued to be used in passenger ships up until the late 1920s. And the ship that I traveled with my parents on from Southampton to Brazil in 1953, no, 52 it was, 51, was built by Harland and Wolff in 1927. It was the Alcantara of Royal Mail Lines, and it had this style of architecture. That style of design gave way to Art Deco in the late 1920s with the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique liner Ile-de-France, and also the Swedish Americans' first Gripsholm, which introduced Art Deco in a big way and it really brought on. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention in that last picture, the dome above the dining room, that was very much a feature of ships before you had extensive architectural lighting. With the wider, lower spaces, you had this dome which brought, it's a clear story, it's like you have on railway cars, that brought light into the interiors of these large and wide spaces. And it was comfortable. It was a style that wasn't too over the top, it wasn't too highbrow, but it was comfortable and it had a good feeling of yeah, that was actually the picture. That was the I didn't know that was the dome above the dining room. Beautiful sideboard there, and the nautical fixtures of the ship's clock and so on. It's a very, very tasteful design. I mean, really, they had no reason to want to change that during all the years that Keewatin was in service. This room was all the way aft on the ship, and it was originally an open deck, and they closed that in, and it became the ballroom. And that was where you would evening entertainment, such that it was. When you were traveling on those ships, you were not looking at cabaret shows and that sort of thing. You were no casino or anything like that. You're pretty well entertained yourself. There was a hi-fi set in there. I don't think I have a picture of it. No, I don't actually. There was a hi-fi set in there, so they could play records and guys. There was a piano. You might have a jazz combo on board with small group of players, but this is the smoking room, which formerly was the aftmost of the public rooms. And I draw your attention to the clock, because it is set to 9:15, and every clock on the ship has been set to 9:15, and that was the precise time, which at the end of Keewatin's last voyage, the final command finished with engines was run down from the bridge and it was locked. So all of the clocks on the ship are set to that time, which was underactive service life actually ended.
And in the morning or evening?
Evening, sort of 9:15 p.m. Just another part of the smoking room, very typical. In its heyday, that would have been gentlemen only. Now, during the 60s, it was just another lounge area that people could use. Again, we're looking at the accommodation deck up through the flower well. And you're looking to the main stairway. Further aft, you're beneath the dining room there, so it only has the one deck height. But the interesting thing is that you got light into this space from the outside of the ship, because these small alleyways to either side that give access to the cabins, because the inner and outer cabins also had a porthole at the end, which brought daylight into that part of the ship. That is, again, a typical cabin as you see it today, with the wash basin, cold water tap. On the Atlantic liner, that would have been seawater. And you can notice just at the bottom of the screen, the thunder mode is the chamber pot.
Is that a bed behind them?
No, that's just a settee. These were luxury cabins. Had a settee. There were the beds, the other side behind the door. And everybody got bunks, except for this, there's a half dozen of deluxe cabins. And people were quite happy with that kind of accommodation right up into the 60s. I mean, the ship was popular still. There's this, the thwart ships, the sideways alleyways. So those little alleyways brought light into that central lounge area on the accommodation deck. And apparently it was quite popular. I think at one time they had a piano. This is as good as it gets. That is a deluxe cabin. Keewatin. Two berths side by side. The bathroom was behind where I was standing to take that picture. So, now we get down to where it's dirty. This is the aftmost of the series of deep cargo holds that I was telling you about, where you could carry grain, pelletized iron, and whatever. And this is the aftmost of the cargo holds. This was the coal bunker. And Keewatin was coal-fired for the entire voyage. Right up to 1965, she was burning coal, and she was hand-stoked. The Assiniboia was converted to oil firing sometime during the 1950s. I don't know why they didn't do the same. There you are. That is the coal bunker. I would hate to think what it would have been like pushing that wheelbarrow on a rough November crossing the place. This is one of the ship's Scotch boilers. It's being cut open so that you can see what's the boilers are not serviceable. You cannot restore them, so they just cut it open so that people can see what's inside it. There are labels that explain how it works. When you go through and there are different tours you can take. I'll talk about that in a minute at the end. But when you go through the engine, you walk through a passageway, a safe passageway behind glass panels, where you can look into the boiler rooms. As you can see, you get right up close. Man in the foreground in the back of the camera is my host when I was visiting Kingston last year. Took these photos. The detailed shot of the main engine. Pistons. A quadruple expansion steam engine, single engine driving a single propeller. The engine is intact. It could be started to get steam through it. There's really no question of the ship ever being operational. One of the reasons that she was retired was because the wooden superstructure would not meet current code. So she is well worth a visit. There's a final view looking aft along the line of the propeller shaft. With the engine. The deck at the top here, this is the level of the cargo deck. So the engine protrudes up through the central space of the cargo deck aft of the embarkation lounge, which is in the central. The ship is open to the public from the middle of May, I think, until the end of November in Kingston. The cost is a little bit steep. 42, I checked the prices for this year. It opens on May the 16th this year. And the cost of the tour is from $42 to $80, depending on what you want. You can do a very short tour of the accommodation, of the passenger accommodation only. you can do a much longer tour where they take you all through the machinery spaces, and it's well worth doing if you have a serious interest in the ship. Just one word of caution. No way is this ship area excessive. You're climbing down companion ways, you're climbing over door sills to the flying top. Even the gangways. So you've got to be reasonably. I think most of us would do it. Don't try it. We're all checked.
Do they offer lunch with the $50 tour?
No. How it works is that you can book, like I say, short. I think it's a half-hour tour through passenger accommodations on the upper deck. Or if you do the full Monty, they take you down to the engine room. You can do the engine room tour independently as well as a field tour. I think that was just about the depot siege. Personally, it is steep. I don't know what it costs to go to the lawn of the AGO now. It is steep. I think it's steep. At least it was for me. So, thank you very much.
So look it up. Do they have any?
$36,000 is only 383 in today's dollars, so it's still a bargain.
Wow. Scrap value.
What does the name mean? What is the name?
I think it's a deer. I don't. Cinnaboya. Cinnaboya, you'd think, I can look into it. I think would be a reference to one of the indigenous plants, Cinnaboya, wasn't it?
It could be.
Or was it the Cinnaboya River, because it flows through Winnipeg.
Sorry, Keewatin and the Assiniboia were originally territories in the around Manitoba and through the northwest.
Oh,
And
thank you.
later on became very provinces.
Thank you.
There's it's Keewatin in northern Ontario.
Yes, I think I mentioned that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the different pronunciations. I grew up knowing Keewatin as Keewatin, and then it wasn't until I heard about this boat that it
Yeah.
was Keewatin.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure I can correct pronunciation.
I think those who are familiar with it just call it the key.
The key.
Yeah.
Do we have any comments or questions from online?
A little bit online.
Okay, any, Ron?
Yeah, I was interested when you were looking at some of the earlier slides, you had the Manitoba in one of the pictures.
Yeah,
And when I was talking about the Wolfson Iron Works. Wolfson Iron Works was most of the time in Toronto, but he did locate up there for a while, and they built the Manitoba there.
oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it was interesting to see the pictures of his own construction, because you would think of the shipyard only sounds that could build a 300-foot ship.
you wouldn't think so, yeah.
It was just popped up with a bunch of was beams.
It just sort of built it on the ground.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to find out, I'm still fascinated by this, and I'd like to look more at, some of the other ships. I mean, you've got to dig a bit to find this stuff. But still, it's fascinating subject. And I think too, we're very lucky to have the ship because she's one of the very, very few surviving ships from that era. So we have the Keewatin. We also have the second, which I don't know. I was looking at their website yesterday. They seem to suggest that she's going to be in service this year, but there's no sailing schedules yet.
Is the Winona a sister ship to the Sagan?
No, Winona was built 20 years ago or so, and she is inspired by the second.
Okay.
But she doesn't have a freight deck. That's where the restaurant is. She has an elephant. It's actually accessible.
Winona is accessible.
Yes, she is.
I'll talk about her in just a minute. Are there any other comments or questions, Jim?
On your early pictures, you showed her with an anchor off side in the bow, and I wondered if she asked if you have an anchor because the anchor looked small for that size.
Ah, I don't know, because I mean, she usually just tied up,
Yes.
but I suppose, that, you know, if you have a grounding or if you have to do a rescue at sea or something, you might need to use the. It's a good point.
Sherry,
Yeah, you mentioned Keewatin. I found that interesting because Keewatin is a road that runs east and west, a few blocks north of Eglinton. And it runs east from the district.
You're right, you're right. I used to live up there.
That's where I once lived too. That's a lot when I lived in Keewatin.
I think that's the road you could cycle along to get into the, parks.
and did they call it Keewatin or Keewatin?
Keewatin.
It was Keewatin. Okay. Richard,
I did that same tour you did 2 years ago with my son
Oh,
on
you
the ship. And I can't recommend that highly enough.
Thank
One
you.
of the fascinating things about the cabins is each cabin is restored for a different decade, a
Yes.
different historical period. So you go into one that's Edwardian, you go into one that's 1920s and 1930s. They've done all this with the different cabins. They're all numbered.
Yeah.
And on the outside, they tell you what the years are to try and represent. So you get a sense of what the ship was like and all these different stages of its journey in the past years and the traveled on. And your point about the engine room too, I definitely recommend that, just because one of the things that's very striking about this is the size of the machinery. And
Absolutely.
realizing that this is not a really big ship compared to like Titanic or anything, right?
Yeah.
But the mass and size of everything in that engine room is really something the whole is huge.
It's an and there's lots of space to move around in there, and I mean, you're quite safe. I don't know why, but for some reason I meant to include a slide which showed on the side, the inside of the hull, these huge wrenches and tools. And we were told that the ship came with a set of tools. When you bought the ship, you got the tools with it.
well,
So,
that was before it was outfitted with all the china and everything else.
yeah,
Tools came with
the
the,
tools came with the machinery, yeah.
okay.
I mean, there are wrenches that big, you know.
Yes, you couldn't lift the wrench, yes.
No, let alone use it, yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions? Well, Phil, I would like to thank you. You have once again just brought us so much good detail about this ship, its history, and of course, the moving from Port McNicoll down to Kingston. And certainly tweaked a few ideas about should we go visit it.
Oh, I would say that.
Accept our little token of
Thank you
appreciation.
so much.
And let's give him another time.
Thank you.
So well done. Yeah, yeah, video, future.